Are nearshoring and reshoring solutions to reducing supply chain risk? To discuss it, I'm joined today by Kevin Keegan. He is principal with PwC Strategy Consulting. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Bob. How are you today?
I'm good. So there's been talk now about this idea of dual sourcing scenarios, and I'm wondering to what degree is that achievable? Is it realistic? China plus Mexico or another Asian low-cost country. Can you tell me if that is a legitimate and achievable goal these days for manufacturers?
It is. There's a number of things that are driving the notion of dual sourcing, and perhaps now more than in the past couple of decades. Maybe to go backwards first. So over the past probably 10 to 20 years for most industry sectors, what we have found is that a lot of companies have focused in on supply chain cost and every year asking for further and further reductions. And so that's really driven a lot of manufacturers to do things like single sourcing or asking supply chain partners like contract manufacturers, distributors, and so forth to pick up a bigger burden of managing the supply chain and its reliability.
Mm-hmm.
If you fast forward to the tariff wars that happened in 19, if you fast forward to the pandemic, a lot of underlying vulnerabilities were exposed, where people couldn't get reliable supply and then had trouble reacting quickly when they did have problems. And so that plus a number of other things that are happening now and probably will continue to happen, like manufacturing automation, which is reducing the arbitrage sometimes with low-cost countries, increases in transportation costs, the rise of ESG or the environmental component, carbon footprint of things, et cetera, are really driving companies to reconsider single sourcing strategies that are creating these problems. And so therefore they're looking at dual sourcing options or multi-regional options, at least for the assembly and test, if not for entire product line manufacturing.
So it took a pandemic and it took a trade war to get them to think this way, though, right? Because there were plenty of disruptions prior to that, geographically specific natural disasters such as earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanoes and whatever. But it wasn't until these two big events, it sounds like, that companies didn't started to really seriously think this strategy was a go, right?
Yeah, I think so. Plus, like I said, some of the rise of ESG with institutional investors and shareholders, as well as governments being concerned about supply chain security and wanting to have better protections to make sure that jobs can be protected and won't be disruptions to supply, et cetera.
Yeah. And it's not, as you say, it's dual sourcing. So it's not companies pulling out of China altogether, which was talked about for a while there, because even without these problems, Chinese wages were rising in plants, causing companies to already consider some aspect of reducing their exposure there. But there's no mass exodus of companies, of manufacturers from China, I take it.
No, we haven't seen mass exoduses. What we have seen is sourcing strategies that are a bit sophisticated. So, for example, building in China for China, where there was a Chinese footprint and demand in the market, and then building in another country, perhaps Southeast Asia, leveraging similar supply base, similar contract manufacturing companies, partners, and things like that for rest of the world. We're seeing that. We're also still seeing base assembly for products that can be configured coming out of China in kind of aggregate volumes, and then being dispersed for regional or second source final assembly and test. That also helps with country of origin rules and other protections for safety and backup.
So if we're talking about a dual sourcing strategy, and one of the sources is China, or even for that matter, another low-cost Asian country, what is the other one? Is it the United States? Is it Mexico? Is it back to this hemisphere somewhere? Where is it typically being found?
Yeah, we're finding that it varies a bit by the company's history, because obviously moving manufacturing around and suppliers and all of recontracting and one-time costs, et cetera, are very expensive. And there's so many demands on budgets. So people are moving, naturally from where their organic base was. And we're not seeing necessarily a uniform change all across. However, we are seeing some trends that are important. So for example, companies that want to sell to the US government are now seriously thinking about expanding under the USMCA, their location within Mexico, for example, to supply into the United States, or rethinking some of the duty drawback considerations that they used to have, where they would do intellectual property work in the States, export it for low-cost labor, and then bring it back in, because some of those are going to be changed as well. So our thought is that the US or Mexico on a nearshoring basis is certainly a viable option for sales into the US. Southeast Asia remains strong as well. The countries that have been strong in manufacturing are seeing more volume. And some of the countries that are newer to manufacturing, like Vietnam, are also seeing a rise in there as they develop their infrastructure, as they become an attractive option outside of China, where people have to move outside of China.
Some of these industries operate on extremely thin margins, however, and I'm assuming that this strategy does entail higher costs. I mean, how much higher costs can they bear and still make a profit? Is that a concern for these companies seeking this type of strategy?
Yeah, well, as you know, I mean, OEMs working with their partners really can't, indicate to them that they've got more work to do for the same price. Has to be some negotiation, and really what it's requiring is a comprehensive conversation that really talks about where supply chain risk and management of alternate supply sources and things like that really need to be managed, and then in that they can renegotiate who does what, on an end-to-end role and accountability basis, and we're finding the companies that do that openly, as well as have candid conversations around IT for scenario planning, for data security, things like that, with suppliers of suppliers and whatnot, is really becoming an important new conversation. Again, over the past 15, 20 years, a lot of that has been kind of delegated without management. And now there's a resurgence of really understanding that true end-to-end visibility. The pandemic really manifests some of those issues. And we think that that's really the right way to go for a lot of OEMs and their key suppliers.
But as you add sources, you add complexity to a supply chain. You create the need for supply chain visibility that has always been a challenge for companies, even manufacturing in a single place in Asia. Do these companies have the necessary visibility, especially of multi-tier supply chains, in order to juggle these different sources and see where everything is, where it's going, where it's coming from, and all that?
You're right. Yeah, it is potentially a lot more expensive. What we're finding is, in the past 6 months or so, a lot of companies that are introducing new products are actually using dual sourcing cost models and scenarios within their product design, so that they can collaborate on, using more common parts where they can, using parts that can be supplied from different locations from their supplier base, and then having backup second sources of supply at the second site, so to speak, just in case there is a need for that, or if it's single sourced from one location that has high risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that regard, we're seeing that people are doing the setups very efficiently and trying to get as much leverage as they can. But you're right, at the end of the day, there are more suppliers potentially to manage, and more locations to manage as well.
What about the concept of risk scenario modeling? Are companies employing that? Is that of value and going forward?
Yeah, it's a great point. And the answer is yes. So what we're finding is that companies are using risk modeling, now more than ever. And it's really being driven by the CFOs. For example, we do a pulse survey with CFOs on a regular basis. And supply chain security, supply chain assurance are really top issues. It's something that they get asked every quarter when they meet with the investors and the analysts. And we're finding that they're starting to prioritize the scenario planning. They're taking advantage of, the big data that's out there, things relative to labor rights, political changes that impact tariffs, things like that, and looking at the trends for risk, and then having more automated decision-making and workflows as a complement to scenario planning that allows for very quick action. So, in the event of a disaster, there's actually a playbook that's ready to go that automates, where you shift the next order, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It also is being used not only for like disaster recovery, as we saw in the past 24 months, or in reaction to trade policy changes, but also being used carefully to handle seasonality. So if demand is surging in Europe, they can shift production to the European site as opposed to North American site. And that saves some freight, it saves some lead time, and potentially some localized costs.
They have that type of flexibility, even with their contract manufacturers. They're willing to go up and down in production in accordance with the needs of the OEM.
Yeah, it's being worked. That's another key point you're raising. One of the things that caught a lot of people off guard in the early days of COVID was that they just didn't have synchronized flexibility agreements with their suppliers. They had some that had 20, 30% upside, some that had none. And of course, you have to have all that to work together to actually get a product out the door.
Mm-hmm.
And so they spent a lot of time synchronizing up and down their supply chain and even deeper into their secondary source of supply to make sure that they understand, liquidity, that they understand capacity, that they have most favored nation status where they can. They have upside flexibility and downside flexibility, that the ownership of inventory is clear, et cetera. And they've done a lot of cleanup work to make sure that that flexibility is in place and something that's more reliable.
Well, it looks like we are seeing some permanent changes in global supply chains, and one of which is this dual sourcing model. So, Kevin Keegan of PwC, thank you very much for helping us to understand just where companies are going these days in response to this awareness of heightened risk in supply chains. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate it as well.